The steam was a ghost, rising from the bubbling pot of pork broth, clinging to her face in a humid Tokyo night. It smelled of star anise and ginger, a scent so familiar it was part of her own skin. Amara stirred the rich liquid with a long wooden ladle, the rhythmic clack against the metal pot a steady heartbeat in the chaos of a Shinjuku market. 19 years old, and this was her entire world, a 10 by 10-foot stall, a propane burner that hissed like a snake, and the best ramen on this side of the city. She worked with an economy of motion honed by years of practice. Noodles into the boiling water, a swirl to separate them. A precise ladle of broth into a waiting bowl. A fan of perfectly sliced pork, a soft-boiled egg nestled beside it, a sprinkle of green onions. It was a dance she could do in her sleep. Around her, the market sang its nightly song, the sizzle of yakitori grills, the shouts of vendors, the endless river of feet on pavement. Then, the world went quiet. It wasn't a true silence, but a pocket of it, a void carved out of the noise. It started with the car. A long, black sedan, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the market's neon glow in distorted streaks. It moved with an unnatural slowness, parting the crowds not with a horn, but with its sheer, intimidating presence. It was a predator cruising through a field of mice. The car stopped directly in front of her humble stall. Amara kept her head down, focusing on wiping the worn wooden counter. You didn't look at cars like that. You didn't look at the men who rode in them. You became invisible, a part of the scenery, and you prayed they passed you by. The back window slid down with a faint, electric hum. She could feel the stares of the other vendors, the sudden halt in conversations. The air grew heavy, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the humidity. She risked a glance. All she could see was a hand resting on the open window frame. It was a man's hand, elegant and still, adorned with a single, heavy signet ring of dark, unadorned metal. The cuff of his white shirt was immaculate, the sleeve of his black suit tailored with surgical precision. A voice, low and smooth as worn velvet, cut through the market's hum. One bowl. It wasn't a request. It was a command, issued with the calm certainty of a man who had never been denied anything. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She looked up, past the hand, and met his eyes. They were dark, bottomless, and utterly devoid of emotion. He wasn't looking at the menu or the stall or the steam. He was looking at her. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a masterpiece carved from stone. A thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only imperfection on an otherwise flawless canvas. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "What kind?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The one you make," he said, his gaze unwavering. That was it. No further instruction. She turned back to her station, her hands moving on autopilot. Her mind, however, was screaming. This man was not a tourist. He was not a salaryman on his way home. He was danger, wrapped in a $1,000 suit and smelling faintly of sandalwood and smoke. The other customers who had been waiting melted back into the crowd, leaving a wide, empty space around her stall. She prepared the bowl with trembling hands, her usual grace deserting her. She could feel his eyes on her back, a physical weight. The noodles cooked. The broth was ladled. The toppings were arranged. It was perfect, just like every other bowl she'd ever made, but it felt different. It felt like a final exam, a test she didn't know she was taking. When it was ready, she picked up the heavy ceramic bowl. She would normally pass it to a customer over the counter, but he was in the car. She took a hesitant step forward, leaving the sanctuary of her stall. The air outside felt colder, charged. She held the bowl out toward the window. One of his men, a mountain in a suit sitting in the passenger seat, made a move to get out, presumably to take it from her. "No," the man in the back said. The word was quiet, but it stopped the mountain instantly. He leaned forward slightly. He took the chopstick she offered, his long fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a jolt of electricity, cold and sharp. And then, To her utter shock, and to the silent, gaping horror of everyone watching, he did not take the bowl. He simply lowered his head and began to eat. From the white bowl she was holding in her trembling hands. The market disappeared. The sounds, the smells, the people, it all faded into a blur. There was only the man in the car, the weight of the bowl in her hands, and the quiet, rhythmic click of his chopsticks. He ate with a focused intensity, his eyes never leaving hers. It was the most intimate, terrifying thing she had ever experienced. It was an act of possession, a public declaration she couldn't possibly understand. He was not just eating her ramen, he was consuming her, marking her in front of the entire world. He finished every last drop of the broth, a gesture of ultimate respect for a ramen chef. When he was done, he placed the chopsticks neatly across the empty bowl. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice still low, still calm. "Amara," she whispered. He considered her name for a moment, tasting it as he had tasted her soup. "Amara," he repeated, and the way he said it was different. It sounded like a claim. He reached into his suit and pulled out a thick wad of cash, placing it on the edge of her counter. It was more money than she made in a month.
"Close your stall," he said.
Before she could process the words, the window slid up, sealing him away. The black car pulled away from the curb as silently as it had arrived, disappearing into the river of Tokyo traffic. Amara stood frozen, the empty bowl still in her hands, the warmth of the ceramic a fading memory. The wad of cash sat on her counter, a silent, damning piece of evidence. The market slowly came back to life around her, but it was different now. The whispers had started. She was no longer just the ramen girl. She was the girl who had fed Kenji Tanaka from her own hands. She would think about that later, about the fear and the confusion. But in that moment, all she could feel was the ghost of his touch on her fingers and the chilling certainty that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. That was the moment everything changed. An hour later, as she was packing up, her hands still not quite steady, two men in dark suits approached her stall. They were not the men from the car, but they carried the same aura of quiet authority. They didn't threaten her. They didn't raise their voices. They simply stood there. "Mr. Tanaka requires your presence," the taller one said. His voice was polite, but his eyes were hard.
I
have to clean up," she stammered, a pathetic excuse. "It will be taken care of," the man said. He gestured to her cart, her pots, her entire life's work. "Everything will be taken care of." The unspoken part of that sentence hung in the air, whether you come with us or not. She had a choice, but it wasn't a real one. She could run, but where would she go? A man like that, a man who could silence a market with a look, his reach was absolute. She thought of the wad of cash, still tucked into her apron. It wasn't a payment. It was a down payment. She untied her apron, her movements stiff. She placed it on the counter. She took one last look at the stall that had been her sanctuary, and then she walked away from it, flanked by two silent men who led her to another black car. The life she knew was over. She was being taken. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel, perched high above the glittering expanse of Tokyo. It was beautiful and sterile, a silent world of polished marble, minimalist furniture, and a view that stretched to eternity. It felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit on wealth and power. Amara stood in the center of the vast living room, feeling small and out of place, her worn jeans and t-shirt a stark contrast to the stark luxury surrounding her. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't spoken since she'd been brought in, escorted by silent men who had melted away as soon as he was in sight. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and watchful. "You have questions," he said, not turning around. It wasn't a question. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My home. Why am I here?" He finally turned, his dark eyes pinning her in place from across the room. He moved like the room owed him space. "Because your ramen was
familiar."
That was not the answer she expected. Of all the terrifying possibilities that had been racing through her mind, The quality of her broth was not one of them.
Familiar?
He walked toward her, his steps silent on the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to smell that scent of sandalwood and smoke again. My mother used to make a broth like that.
Rich.
A little sweet from the mirin. She was not a good cook. It was the only thing she ever made that tasted of home. He looked past her, his gaze distant, and for a fleeting second, the cold mask slipped. She saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of old pain, a wound that had never properly healed. It was a vulnerability so profound and so quickly hidden that she almost thought she'd imagined it. The shame he carried for something he could not prevent. "She died when I was a boy," he said, his voice flat, all emotion carefully scrubbed from it. "She was taken from me because of who my father was, because of who I would become." That is when she made the mistake of looking up, truly meeting his gaze. She saw the truth of it. The ramen hadn't just been a meal. It had been a memory, a ghost. And somehow, he had decided she was the keeper of it. "I can't eat," he said, the admission so quiet she barely heard it. "The doctors call it a symptom of stress. My chefs prepare feasts. I taste nothing. For 20 years, food has been ash in my mouth." He took a step closer. "Until tonight. Tonight I ate. And I felt peace." The air crackled. The danger escalated. It wasn't about her ramen anymore. It was about what she represented. A cure. A comfort. A possession he had no intention of giving up. The first sign of the true danger came 3 days later. She had been a ghost in his glass cage, confined to the penthouse, with a silent housekeeper who brought her meals she barely touched. He was gone most of the time, a phantom presence in his own home. But that night he was there. The explosion rocked the entire building, a deep, guttural roar that shattered the panoramic windows. Glass rained down like glittering, deadly snow. Alarms blared, a piercing shriek that drilled into her skull. Amara was thrown to the floor, the marble cold and hard against her cheek. Before she could even register what had happened, he was moving. He moved through the chaos like it was his natural element, a predator in the storm. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her to her feet. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the alarms. Men in suits appeared from nowhere, guns drawn, forming a protective circle. Gunfire erupted from the hallway, sharp, popping sounds that were terrifyingly real. This wasn't a movie. This was his life. And now it was hers. He shoved her behind him, his body a solid wall shielding her from the chaos. She could feel the heat of him, the tension coiled in his muscles. In the flashing emergency lights, she saw a slick of blood on his temple. A piece of flying glass had cut him. He was giving orders in a clipped, calm Japanese she didn't understand, his men responding with lethal efficiency. In the midst of the firefight, there was a lull, a chance. An open-service elevator, its doors pried open by one of his men. It was an escape route. She could have run. No one would have stopped her. They were focused on the threat, on protecting him. She could have disappeared into the chaos of the city. She looked at the open elevator, then back at him. At the blood trickling down the side of his face, staining the perfect collar of his shirt. And she made a choice. She didn't run. Instead, she ripped a piece of fabric from the hem of her own shirt, a long strip of cotton. She reached up, her hand shaking, and pressed it against the cut on his temple. He flinched, not from pain, but from surprise. His dark eyes locked onto hers, wide with something she couldn't name. The gunfire, the shouting, the alarms, it all faded away. There was only the pressure of her hand on his skin, the smell of cordite and his cologne, the impossible silence between them. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In that moment of shared violence, a bond was forged. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to help him. And, in his world, a choice like that was a debt of blood. The safe house was a world away from the glass penthouse. It was a traditional Japanese house, hidden behind high stone walls in a quiet Kyoto neighborhood. Paper screens replaced glass walls, and the scent of old wood and rain replaced the sterile air of the city. Here, the silence was different. It was peaceful, ancient. Amara knelt on a tatami mat, dabbing an antiseptic wipe on the cut above Kenji's eye. The chaos of the attack had subsided, leaving a strange, vibrating tension in its wake. His men were ghosts at the perimeter of the property, leaving them in a bubble of forced intimacy. He had refused a doctor, another sign of his deep-seated distrust of outsiders. So the task had fallen to her. He sat perfectly still, his back straight, watching her with an unnerving intensity. He had shed his ruined suit jacket, and the white shirt he wore was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint, dark lines of ink coiling around his neck and disappearing downwards. Tattoos of a man bound by an oath. "You could have left," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "The elevator. You could have run." "You were bleeding," she replied simply, not looking up from her task. Her fingers were gentle as she applied a small bandage. "Many men bleed for me. It is their job. It is not yours." He reached up and caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. Her hand froze, hovering near his face. His thumb stroked the inside of her wrist, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver through her. "Why did you stay, Amara?" She told herself it was survival instinct, that a bleeding crime boss was no use to her. But she knew it was a lie. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the honest truth. He held her gaze, and the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't say. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, a king in a kingdom of violence and fear. But in the quiet moments like this one, she saw the flicker of the boy who had lost his mother, the man who tasted nothing but ash. The attack had changed things. The enemy, the Hashimoto clan, he had told her, a rival faction hungry for his territory, now knew she existed. They had seen him shield her. They had seen him prioritize her safety. They had seen a weakness. The proof of this came 2 nights later. Kenji was in a meeting in another part of the house. Amara was in the small, serene garden, trying to find a moment of peace under the pale moonlight. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and moss. They came without a sound, 2 shadows detaching themselves from the deeper darkness of the garden. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth and a strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She thrashed, kicking, but the man holding her was a wall of muscle. They were dragging her toward the back wall, toward escape. Her mind raced. She was not helpless. She would not be a passive victim. Her fingers scrabbled for purchase, finding a loose, heavy stone from the garden's decorative border. She gripped it, her knuckles white. With all her strength, she swung her arm back, smashing the rock into the face of the man holding her. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She broke free, stumbling forward. The other man was on her in an instant, a knife flashing in the moonlight. She scrambled backward, falling onto the damp moss. He loomed over her, his face a mask of cruel intent. This was it. This was how she died. But then, a blur of motion.
"Kenji."
He moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. He hadn't made a sound, but he was there, a demon conjured from the shadows. There was no wasted effort, no flourish. It was surgical. A swift, brutal strike to the man's throat. A twist of the arm that held the knife, a sickening crack of bone. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other man, the one she had hit with the rock, drew a gun. He was too slow. Kenji was already turning, his movements impossibly fast. He closed the distance between them in 2 silent steps. The gunshot was deafening in the small garden, but the bullet went wide, burying itself in the ancient stone wall. Kenji disarmed him with the same brutal efficiency, and a moment later, the second man lay still on the ground. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Kenji stood over the 2 bodies, his chest rising and falling, the only sign of his exertion. He turned to look at her, his face dark and unreadable in the moonlight. He saw her on the ground, the rock still clutched in her hand, her knuckles scraped and bleeding. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the defiance. She had fought back. She had crossed a line she could not uncross. He walked over and knelt in front of her. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Instead, he gently took her hand, the one holding the rock, and uncurled her stiff fingers. The rock fell to the moss with a soft thud. He examined her bleeding knuckles, his touch surprisingly gentle. "The thought of them touching you," he said, his voice raspy, raw with an emotion he couldn't hide. "It is a feeling I have not had since I was a boy. It is unacceptable." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of possession, a claim staked in blood and violence. He was no longer just her captor. He was her protector. And she, in turn, was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor who had drawn blood to stay alive in his world. The next day, a package arrived. A simple wooden box left at the front gate. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, was a single, perfect bowl of ramen noodles, the kind she used to sell from her stall. It was a message from the Hashimoto clan, clear and chilling. "We know who she was. We know where she came from. We can touch her past." The war was no longer just his. It had become personal. The final confrontation was set for a neutral location, a high-end, traditional restaurant in Gion, Kyoto's geisha district, a place of quiet elegance and unspoken rules. The head of the Hashimoto clan had requested a meeting to discuss terms of a truce. It was a lie. Both Kenji and Amara knew it was a trap. "You will not go," Kenji had stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. They were in the main room of the safe house, the air thick with impending violence. "They made this about me," Amara countered, standing her ground. She was no longer the frightened girl from the market. The last few weeks had forged something new in her, something harder. "They sent that bowl to me. If I hide while you fight a war that started because of me, what does that make me?" He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He was the head of a powerful Yakuza clan, a man who commanded legions of soldiers with a single word. But in that moment, he could not command this one woman. He saw that trying to protect her by hiding her would only break her spirit. And he had come to value that spirit more than her safety. He gave a single, sharp nod. "You will not leave my side." The restaurant was a maze of polished wood and paper screens. The air smelled of incense and expensive sake. Hashimoto was waiting for them in a private room, flanked by two of his largest enforcers. He was an older man with a cruel smile and eyes like chips of obsidian. The negotiations were a farce, a delicate dance of veiled threats and false pleasantries. Kenji was a master of this game, his voice calm and measured, giving away nothing. Amara sat beside him, silent and observant, her hands folded in her lap. She felt like a chess piece, the queen placed deliberately in the center of the board. As expected, the trap was sprung. Hashimoto gave a subtle signal, and his men moved, drawing concealed weapons. But Kenji's men, disguised as restaurant staff, were faster. The room exploded into chaos. In the confusion, Hashimoto himself lunged for Amara, grabbing her, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. A cold blade pressed against her throat. "End this now, Tanaka," Hashimoto snarled, his breath hot on her neck. "Or she dies." Kenji froze, his face a mask of cold fury. His men hesitated. This was the moment Hashimoto had wanted, the one variable he could control. But he hadn't accounted for Amara. She was not a soldier. She was not a killer. She was a cook. And she saw the room not as a battlefield, but as a kitchen. On the low table in front of them sat a heavy, cast-iron teapot full of boiling water for tea. She acted before she thought. She stomped down hard on Hashimoto's instep with her heel. As he grunted in pain, his grip momentarily slackening, she grabbed the heavy teapot with both hands. It was searingly hot, but she ignored the pain. With a desperate cry, she swung it around and slammed it into the side of his head. Boiling water and tea leaves splashed across his face. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, letting her go as he clawed at his scalded face. That was the opening Kenji needed. The end was swift and brutal. The threat of the Hashimoto clan was eliminated, not with a treaty, but with the sharp, final punctuation of violence. When it was over, the room was a wreck of splintered wood and still bodies. Kenji's loyal lieutenant, a man who had been with him for years, lay dead by the door. A cost had been paid. Nothing in this world was free. Kenji walked through the carnage and stood before Amara. She was trembling, her hands bright red and blistering from the teapot. She looked at him, her eyes wide with shock at what she had done. She had acted decisively. She had saved herself, and in doing so, had saved him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't comfort her. He simply reached out and took her burned hands in his, examining the damage. His touch was incredibly gentle. He looked from her hands to her eyes, and his next words were not for his men, or for the dead, but for her alone. "You are the mark of my world now," he said, his voice low and certain. "It suits you." It was not a compliment. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of it, marked by it, and in his eyes, she was magnificent. They didn't speak on the long, silent drive back to Tokyo, back to the glass penthouse that had once been her prison. The city lights blurred past the window, a river of diamonds. When they arrived, the broken windows had been replaced, the mess cleaned away. It was as if the attack had never happened. He led her not to the guest room she had been using, but to the master suite, a vast, minimalist space dominated by a low bed and another wall of glass overlooking the city. On a small table by the window sat 2 steaming bowls of ramen. It was her recipe. The rich pork broth, the perfectly sliced pork, the soft-boiled egg, the sprinkle of green onions. He had learned it, or he had ordered someone to learn it with perfect precision. He sat down at the table, his movements deliberate. He picked up his chopsticks. He looked at the empty seat across from him, and then he looked at her. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't propose marriage or declare his undying love. He simply waited. The bowl of ramen was not just food. It was a question.
It was a contract.
It was the rest of her life, sitting there, steaming in a simple white bowl. Her hands throbbed with a blistering pain. Her old life was a ghost, a half-forgotten dream. In front of her was a man who was both a monster and a sanctuary, a world of violence and a strange, terrifying peace. She could walk away. The door was unlocked, but she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would never be safe or whole anywhere else. His world had claimed her, and she had claimed her place within it. Amara walked to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. She picked up her chopsticks. Across from her, Kenji Tanaka, the most dangerous man in Tokyo, began to eat.